In this video, I'm going to tell you about the world of Cyberpunk, what it means, and how you can play it in the world of tabletop miniatures games. So you've probably, if you've been paying any attention to, say, video games for the last couple of weeks, maybe the last couple of months, maybe all of 2020, you've probably heard about this game called Cyberpunk 2077. And it is a video game that was being developed by the same people who did the Witcher series of games, CD Projekt Red, and it has finally come out. It was supposed to come out back in April, and then, it got pushed and pushed and pushed, and now it's out. Now, it's got some bugs from what I have been told. I've been playing it on PC, where I've been seeing a little bit of bugginess, but not as much as I think some of the consoles have, specifically the last generation ones. But nonetheless, the concept of Cyberpunk, this is not something that they invented over there in Poland at CD Projekt Red. This particular game, Cyberpunk 2077, is actually based off of a role-playing game, pen and paper role-playing game. This is the most recent version of the pen and paper role-playing game. It's called Cyberpunk Red. Previous game, I think, was called Cyberpunk 2020, which is where we are now. And then the previous version to that was either Cyberpunk 2013 or just called Cyberpunk, but it originally came out in 1984. Our Talsorian, company that originally made this game, also did not invent Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk has been around for a while as a concept. And it's been in books like Snow Crash and Neuromancer and movies like, to some degree, Blade Runner and Johnny Mnemonic. It's been around for a while, but it's not a thing that you see too much of in the world of tabletop gaming like we do, as far as miniatures and stuff like that. But you're starting to see a little bit more, so I thought I'd talk a little bit about it today if you're interested in taking the world, the very rich, frankly, world of Cyberpunk and bringing it to little tiny people on your tabletop. So what is Cyberpunk specifically? Well, it's kind of one of those things that you know it when you see it. It's science fiction, but it's not too spacey. It's not Star Wars. It's not, Star Trek. There's almost never any aliens in Cyberpunk stuff. It's all predominantly just concerned with us down here on this planet. You may have off-world colonies and things like that, but generally it's happening here on our planet. I've got a bunch of notes, actually, so I don't forget any. So it's not too spacey, like I said. It's very frequently hacking and extreme technology. Those are both things that are definitely part of Cyberpunk. You've got, people from the 80s when they were first coming up with the first Cyberpunk RPG, thinking about things that kind of turned into like the internet and the Matrix and all kinds of things like that we're familiar with these days. Those things are from kind of back then, or at least, were imagined. And there's a lot of other extreme technology, specifically in weapons and things like that. But it's interesting because very frequently you also have a lot of thought about melee combat. That happens a lot in Cyberpunk. There are plenty of folks out there with absolutely horrifically powered guns who are then also carrying a katana. You know what I mean? And that kind of leads into the next thing, which is there's frequently a lot of Asian influence. And I think that that's partially, again, going back to kind of when Cyberpunk sort of started, specifically as a game. It was in the mid-'80s. We were seeing the rise of Japan as a business power and things like that. And I think a lot of, authors just basically extrapolated and said, well, what happens in 50 years, along this same trajectory? And so you see a lot of Asian influence. And because of that, you do see sort of the street samurai ideal, where you have this person who has a sword, but very frequently also a gun. You do see a lot of that also in Cyberpunk. It's a lot of urban sprawl, and there's a lot of focus on crime. This is generally not my military versus your military or my country versus your country. It is very frequently my group of basically ne'er-do-wells who have been paid by somebody, who got paid by somebody else, who got paid by somebody probably up in a big building, and we're here to do this thing. Break into this computer, break into this warehouse, and there are rent-a-cops all the way up to, private security forces who are here to try to stop us, and that kind of thing. That's generally what's going on in a lot of Cyberpunk-style games. And again, like I said, a lot of urban sprawl. This doesn't take place in an open field. You're not going to usually put down a grass mat if you're going to be playing a lot of Cyberpunk. And then, of course, there's the whole transhumanity thing about replacing parts, getting a cool cyber eye, cyber arm, and all those kind of things, and how all those things kind of come together And the question is, well, how do all those things come together to play in a tabletop game? Very importantly, number one, I've never come across a Cyberpunk army game, which is to say army scale. I've never seen a Cyberpunk game where each side has 40, 50, 60 different models like you do in a lot of army style games. This is almost always skirmish as far as I can tell. If you know of a Cyberpunk army game out there, put it in the comments below because I'd be interested in taking a look at it just to get it in my head and so I can understand it a little bit better. But predominantly much smaller groups, far fewer models in any kind of Cyberpunk game. All right, so now I'm going to talk about a couple of games that I'm familiar with because I own them and I've read them and I've played them even a little bit. First one's Reality's Edge, and this is by Osprey Games. It's written by Joseph McGuire. You might know him from This Is Not a Test, which is a post-apocalyptic skirmish game that he produced, and it's kind of a little bit along the lines of like Fallout, the video game, but it's, tabletop game. And this is a cyberpunk game. It's thick. You'll notice here, it's thick with 2 C's, 320 pages, and because it's an Osprey book, it's got a bunch of great layout and a bunch of great artwork, and it's got plenty of pages of artwork. It's interesting because I found with a lot of Osprey stuff, they do have a tendency to spread out the text a lot. There's a lot of like white space. There's not necessarily on every page tons and tons of text. And honestly, as a person who's getting older, and you may also be getting older, I'm assuming we all are, I kind of appreciate that because with some games, specifically where there's like 2 columns and tons of tiny text, I find it kind of difficult sometimes to get through there. So I do appreciate that, but it does definitely make for a thicker and sometimes obviously more expensive book. This game is basically kind of, as far as theme, kind of a love letter to the cyberpunk genre. Pretty much everything is covered in here, from hackers and street samurai to fixers and all the stuff that you see in most of the other games out there. This kind of stuff has been covered in here. This is not a big departure or we're going to reinvent cyberpunk. This is I think a pretty competent, I like the rules set. I like the D10s that he uses a lot. It's the same stuff he does kind of with This Is Not a Test. So if you like This Is Not a Test and you're interested in cyberpunk, this is going to be the way you want to be probably taking a look. It's an interesting book in that it goes maybe a little bit deeper sometimes than I might like, but you can obviously always decide, well, we're not going to delve into that. We're not going to look at this part. We're not going to work with this part. We're just going to stick with the combat and the skirmishy stuff. But there's plenty of stuff in here about hacking, campaign stuff, all of that. It's really interesting, and it has, like I said, it covers pretty much everything, and it shows because of the size. But if you're interested, I'm pretty sure that this is still for sale. Another game out there which is much different in scope and comparison, you can tell here by this very, very thin book. This is called Hardwired, and it's written by Patrick Todoroff, which that name you might be finding familiar because Patrick Todoroff worked with Osprey to write a game that I really enjoy called Zona Alpha that I've talked about a bunch on the live show and a couple other places. Zona Alpha is a cool game that is about kind of a story that takes place. It's a Russian novel called Roadside Picnic. If you know it, you know it. But if not, definitely check it out. It's a super interesting story, a collection of short stories that then, he's used as a emphasis to get into the game that Zona Alpha, which is very cool. This is something that's basically using cyberpunk. And again, not going outside the lines. It's pretty much standard cyberpunk. You've got hacking, you've got street samurai, guys with guns, women with, laser claws and all that stuff, right? The difference here is that this game is cooperative. This game is not like this one where it's my group of, cyberpunk bad guys versus your group. In this game, it can be played solo, as most cooperative games can, but it can also be played with multiple people who are all on the same side, kind of like in a role-playing game, and they are fighting against generally what's known as HSEC, which is hostile security. So, like the corporate security people, anything from, again, rent-a-cops all the way up to, hardcore, power-armored, whatever. It's very interesting. It's got a relatively simpler system, I would say, than something like this, obviously. I mean, it's very thin. It's also very kind of self-published. Again, kind of bigger type, which I like, but it's not incredibly deep. But it's a fun, cool game that I really sort of enjoy, and the benefit of having it being a cooperative game, which you don't find a lot in skirmish games, and also even potentially, very playable as a solo game, I think is very cool. You can get this, both of these I think you can get as a PDF as well if you're not into carrying around big, thick books. Many of you out there are saying, but what about Infinity? Like, Infinity is a well-known game by Corvus Belli that's been around for a number of years, and it's very cyberpunk. Well, you know how I mentioned earlier before, you kind of know it when you see it? I don't think that Infinity is cyberpunk, in my opinion, and let me tell you why. It's a little bit more anime spacey kind of than I'm used to for cyberpunk. There are plenty of models in the Infinity line that work great for building your own kind of cyberpunk, force, warband, group, crew, whatever, that you might use in a game like this or in a game like Reality's Edge. But I feel as if that and even though there's hacking and stuff like that in Infinity, it still comes across further down the road sci-fi wise. It takes place generally not on Earth, which is kind of a big deal. It does. There's just a lot of different things about it. Again, I'm not saying it's a bad game. It's not a game that I play. I've done demos of it before, and it's just never quite stuck with me. The models, like I said, there are certain ones that would be absolutely perfect. So if you're looking to get into a cyberpunk game, you're going to pick one of these or some of the other ones that you might see in the comments or anything along those lines. Definitely look at the cyberpunk or the Infinity line for cyberpunk models, because there are some that are very crazy, super high, technology and beyond what you would probably have in cyberpunk. And then there are plenty of them that would work perfectly for, working with your cyberpunk group for whatever game that you decide to play within that universe. So what other models would be good for cyberpunk games? Well, Necromunda, to some degree, I think can have some good models that work within it. You have things like Van Sar. They're the most high-tech of the Necromunda, groups, the gangs, the houses. So they would work, I think, great for cyberpunk. Every time I've ever seen those models that I've been working on them and stuff like that, I've always been like, this is a cyberpunk model, absolutely. There are other groups within there. If you kit bash a lot on some of them, maybe House Caudor, maybe House Orlok, maybe you could pull it off. You could even technically go with like Goliath or Escher, really, as long as you maybe toned them down a little bit almost, or you made them, gave them some more cybery stuff. If you could get them some robot arms, that would be perfect. Then those models would work spectacular for something like Cyberpunk. There's not a lot of robottery. That's not the right word at all, but there's not a lot of that going on in any of the models much for Necromunda. So if you can kit bash those things, then you probably could use those models and make them look really sweet. Another company out there that does it is a much older company. It's a game called Resolution with a Z, not R-E-Z, Resolution. They're hard to find, but you might be able to find them on eBay. You might even be able to find them on some other sites, online sites. But not everything also from their line is perfect for Cyberpunk, but I own a bunch of the models that do work very well, specifically as the hostile security or the corporate security, corporate forces, things like that. There's a bunch of models in that line that work out quite well for that stuff. And then there's another game out there called Human Interface, which is more board gamey. It's still very, very cyberpunk, but it's a little bit more board gamey. But the models that they sell are generally quite good for using for cyberpunk. But they also have a Patreon. So they're one of those companies that's doing the thing with the Patreon where you buy every month and you get a whole bunch of STL files so that you can 3D print your own models, or maybe a friend who owns a resin printer could then 3D print the models. And they're really cool. But you can also pick up a lot of the a la carte models. So you'll pay a bit more because you're not paying monthly. So you're buying a little bit more per model, but then you also get to pick and choose and all that kind of stuff. A company called My Mini Factory. If you haven't looked at My Mini Factory and you're into 3D printing, you're doing yourself a disservice. Not a sponsored anything or anything, but definitely if you just type cyberpunk into that system, you find so much stuff. The people from Human Interface are under Unit 9 on My Mini Factory, and you can find just so many models that fit perfectly into the cyberpunk realm as long as you either have a printer, 3D printer, or whatever, or a friend with one. One other issue with cyberpunk games is that you can't use your normal terrain generally that you would use for games like 40K, let's say, or Star Wars necessarily, Legion, that kind of thing. Like I mentioned earlier, when you're going to sit down and play a game of Cyberpunk, you don't usually lay down a green grass mat. You need to lay down asphalt, street, buildings, tall buildings, verticality, street signs, flying cars that are parked and stuff like that. All that kind of stuff is the stuff that you find in a Cyberpunk landscape. So trying to find terrain for it is a little bit more difficult. Last year, during the Tabletop Minions Awards, 2019, one of the products that I gave the nod to was a series from Death Ray Designs called New Series? Whatever, anyway. Really cool MDF buildings, very, very, very cyberpunky, very modular. You can get a lot out of them. I really liked those models, which is why I put them in the Tabletop Minions Awards. If you're interested, the 2020 awards actually are coming next week on Christmas Day, so keep an eye out for those. Other things that you can find, if you can find terrain that's designed for Infinity, it will pretty much always work for regular Cyberpunk stuff as well, for the most part. Generally, I find it works best if you really grunge things up, not just the Infinity terrain, but any terrain that you use for Cyberpunk. As I've been playing the Cyberpunk video game on the PC a bit, and just looking at the buildings and looking at the amount of art that they put into that game, I'm just constantly looking at that stuff from the eye of what kind of terrain is there out there? What could I do that's like this, that could be even close to this? And it's a bunch of work. Trying to find the models, they're not as easy to find as sci-fi or fantasy stuff. Trying to find terrain, also not quite as easy. And even the rule sets are a little hard to find. But if you are interested in the kind of cyberpunk story and all the things that it talks about, what makes a human, what brings us versus them being the corporate overlords and all that kind of stuff. If you're interested in playing these things out in miniatures games, Cyberpunk games can be very interesting and a really kind of a definite palate cleanser if you've been doing the other two things for a good long time. So if there's some models that you know of that you love to use for Cyberpunk type games, down below in the comments, please. Same with games. If there's some games I didn't mention, other ones that are out there. I literally just remembered Monster Fight Club is making a skirmish game that's going to be a Kickstarter coming out soon that's based off of Cyberpunk Red. I think it's called Combat Zone or something like that. And it should be coming soon too. So there's going to be probably more models coming out for that and another rule set. But if there's models, rule sets, terrain, any of that kind of stuff, put it down below. And hopefully we can maybe get some more people interested in playing something that's a little different than just either fantasy or either, sci-fi. 1, 2, 3, folks.